is Grace-Lynn, and my project is entitled Into My Mother's Womb, The Violence of Narration. My mentor was Christiana Giordano from the Department of Anthropology, and I'm so grateful for all her help. The motivation of this project really has to do with the fact that America has argued that the slave institution that took form on its soil was no different than that of the slave institutions of medieval times. However, if we accurately define this slave institution as chattel slavery, it enables us to see just how peculiar it was. However, there has been an overt denial of the historical violence that made up chattel slavery. And not only has it hidden the Black body in various places in America, but it enables this structural violence to continue today. My hope is that we are able to see that violence against Black people never ended post-emancipation, and therefore is not a new issue that we're seeing today, but something that America has been actively ignoring. So my research questions that are going to help me tackle this big subject is really have to do with language. What is the definition of the word slave? What is the origin of the slave? Who is the slave? The methods that I employ to answer these questions, one can easily be defined as ethnographic, one-on-one interviews with Black mothers. However, my goal in doing these interviews was not to ascribe any sociological or psychological pathology to them, or really any scientific understanding to the information they shared. I gave them a chance to get to know me as a researcher and as a friend, inviting them to share their truths in a space where they felt comfortable, safe, and had knowledge about how this information would be used. I then went on to take these narrative truths and create artwork that spoke to the issues that were brought forth. By way of images, I endeavored to bring to life emotions that just could not be expressed in words. So one extraordinary woman I got to work with, her name is Grace-Lynn. She's a Black mother and social activist. Following the death of George Floyd, she spent 250 days on the ground leading protests and just being extraordinary. I would like to leave with a quote from one of our conversations in which she says, "I don't get the ability to hide anymore. It comes with the work. It comes with the territory, especially the new age of social media that we're in. It's a part of it, you know? So you take it, and it's unlike anything else. Like, I'm an artist, you know? So I was saying to my partner the other day, wow, if all this type of like care or attention was coming towards like my art, you know? If I was having the experience that I'm like going to the grocery store and people seeing me and identifying who I am and things like that, it would be a completely different experience. Yeah, and this one, where people who are on the outside looking in, that exude maybe jealousy or wish to be in a position like this, aren't taking into consideration that like any of these interactions when I'm at the store, when I'm out to eat, when I'm with my child, I don't know why someone's walking up. And based on the work I do, they could obviously feel really good about it or really not good about it. And so it's a constant feeling of paranoia a lot of the time. And as I'm looking further into activists who have done real work, just the suicide rate, the tendency to fall victim to just the circumstance of people and the way that they respond to doing this kind of work has really opened my eyes. A lot of people forget that I'm a mom. So my big question is this: how is it that we can so easily forget that Jaden is a mother? First off, let's do something that America often tries not to do, is start with history, the historical representation of the slave in American media. It wouldn't be until 1915 in W.D. Griffith's silent film Birth of a Nation, in which he depicts the American slave as happy, enthusiastic, that we see the first representation of the slave in American media. It wouldn't be till 1977 that Alexis Haley's book Roots counteracts this false narrative. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture writes this: Roots marked the first time America witnessed slavery portrayed in detail. Along with the scenes of transporting, selling, and trading men and women, were scenes showing the brutality African Americans often suffered at the hands of slave owners. The depictions of abuse and cruelty were limited, of course, but the medium by what American society would accept at the time. Thus, of course, according to white American sensitivity, is what was produced. It wouldn't be till 3 decades later that we get critically acclaimed films like 12 Years a Slave that accurately portray the brutality that made up the slave institution. And this film is winning Oscars and awards such as that. So then, if we can't trust media, let's look at primary sources such as slave narratives. However, when looking at the Library of Congress, it is made clear that slave narratives in America's political agenda is also clear. As the antebellum period began to fade, so did the truth regarding the horrific nature of slavery. Instead, slave narratives were used as a political propaganda to ensure that another civil war would not break out. So during the antebellum period, we see that these sensational revelations, is what they call them, slave life, counteracted the stories that slave owners were telling. However, they also say this: these narratives enjoyed immense popularity, were eagerly sought out for publication by abolitionist journals, and proved financially successful. Thus, we must go on to post-antebellum, right? Where there was another gain of interest. And this, however, is a nation weary of war, they write, intent upon reconciliation, expressed little desire to be reminded of the realities of life before the war. Most of these narratives that did appear had to do with the plantation legend, nostalgic, of wanting to go back to the popularized Southern local colorist idea of what social life should look like, Blacks as slaves. It wouldn't be until the 1920s and 30s that we see Black people were given questionnaires that sought to capture the gist of slave life. However, while many projects and slave narrative projects claim that this was to capture the truth about slavery, the Library of Congress urges us to seek understanding of why they were doing this elsewhere. So then let's go to political discourse. Paul Finkelman investigates, and he says in 1621, when the Englishmen first arrived in Virginia, one of the greatest of the 13 colonies, there were no laws that classified Blacks as slaves. So they worked alongside whites as indentured servants. It wouldn't be until 1660, so 40 years after, that we see a law that finally made the Black body into a commodity in political discourse. So what then is the slave? If we're defining it in political discourse and turning Black people from humans to commodities, in Sadi Harman's book, Lose Your Mother, she defines a slave as a stranger, one torn from kin and community, exiled from one's own country, dishonored and violated. The slave defines the position of the outsider. It wasn't until the transatlantic slave trade, however, that race and slavery were combined. And she writes specifically, it was not until the 16th and 17th century that the slave and the free hardened into a color line. So what is so peculiar about the difference between medieval time slavery and the slavery that took form on American soil? Well, let's talk about the immersion of sexual violence and the violence that was going on during this institution. Slave breeding was a common practice in the South. One woman could easily be forced to give birth to over a dozen slaves. In Gregory D. Smithers' book, he gives an account of one master's slave breeding practices. In his 2012 book, Slave Breeding, Sex, Violence, and Memories in African American History, he describes two slave women who were forced to take two women and create 300 slaves. One woman giving birth to over 25 children, 25 babies, 25 kids. That were used to add to the master's property or to sell and add to his earnings. So we see this as a common practice, but it's written but hidden in plain sight. While chattel slavery or slave breeding was never explicitly spelled out in the laws regarding the early slave institution in America, it was made clear by many laws that Black women were not only denied the right to protect their own body, but their children as well. And Paul Finkelman brings up a statute created by the House of Regrets in which they write, whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by Englishmen upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it therefore enacted that all children born in this country shall be bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. He goes on to say that this law reduced the children of all slave women to property and perversely led to generations of white Southern men to treat their own children as property. Thus, there lies the answer to our question. I posit it's the right to motherhood that was stripped away from Jaden and most Black women in 1662. Black women did not have the right to motherhood. For a slave to give birth to a slave, there has to be no familial ties. Black women and Black people, we worked the land and we also gave birth to it. Never possessing the right to anything, especially our own children. So I'm not surprised that people forget to be Black was once to be forgotten. It was to be that very moment in which we both exist and cease to be all in one, to merely live in the shadows. But how thankful I am for the truth, that we are the light of the world and a town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Therefore, even though America tries to once more drown us out and make the Black body invisible through statistics, there's a story of humanity behind every one of those numbers. And that is the narrative in which I choose to tell. So let's go back to Jaden, because she's more than a statistic, she's alive. And she writes this, she says this in one of our conversations. There's so much conversation about how beautiful having a child is. And there's the other conversation about how hard it is to be a single mother. But there's not a big conversation about being a human being who has now been assigned mother and is still themselves, and the disconnect. The deep disconnect that they physically go through of removing something from their body and then having to be who they were before with all of these new titles, showing up in the same ways that they were before, and how it doesn't happen, and the fallout from that. I went from being a full-time, independent, living on my own supported person to being a single mom on food stamps with no help anywhere, and an abusive relationship. And I'm an educated person, a pretty strong-willed person. I think that's clear to a lot of people. It's not easy to picture me in that situation based on the statistics. So there's either something missing in the statistics, or the statistics aren't telling the story that they should. Thus, I leave us with these project conclusions and theoretical implications. There's a violence to narrative and who gets to write down the words I speak. White America documented the slave trade, but never chattel slavery, because what a disgusting collision for one to have to see. Their holiness and barbarism highlighted for all the world to see. So they documented stories not for truth, but to cover up folly. Yet the truth remains this: the Black slave in America was never set free. Thus I urge us to stop telling the narrative of chattel slavery, the slave and the master no longer exists, since all things live forever through language and memory, and perhaps even numbers. And I want to leave us, since America mobilized the Bible to conquer us, with a verse from it. And they will rise again. Those who have done good will rise to experience eternal life. And those who have continued in evil will rise to experience judgment. John 5:29. And here's a picture of the Pieta and a rendition I did of it, of Mary, a Black Mary holding Jesus, Black Jesus, who's been shot and lynched, in which I urge us to think of these actions as a modern day crucifixion. I'd like to end with this poem that really helped shape this project for me, and I wrote it myself. Nakuma, Nakuma. Sometimes I say this at the end of my prayers as a reminder of the once hope of acceptance, of community, of home, rejection. Estranged, my body is foreign in all its parts. Slave, my only origin found within my mother's womb. Thank you guys.